Okay. Hi, everybody. Dr. Devine here with a couple of students from class, wanting to welcome you to the lecture on Malthusian Legacies. This is the focus of the lecture today. Before we get into it, I want to just remind you that you have your essays due Sunday by 11:55 p.m. by midnight. Tracks insists that we put 11:55 p.m. So please be focusing on that this week and sending me any questions. And by way of reminder, I will be in office hours tomorrow between 2 and 3. So you can hop on Zoom and ask me specific questions about your paper and your analysis, should you like. I did just get a question from somebody that's watching the lecture live about where to find some examples of the other previously done successful examples of the paper. I'm going to do this here. I want to show you one thing. I'm going to go to tracks and show you where that is. Okay, so here I am in political geography. I'm going to go to resources, and then under prompts and rubrics, under racial segregation analysis, you have an example of Harrisburg here and another example from somewhere else, I can't remember. So that's where you can find examples of previous essays, if you'd like to sort of see what an A-level paper has looked like in the class prior to this semester. Does anybody else have any other questions about the paper? Of course, if you have specific questions about your particular research topic, that's better suited for tomorrow's office hours, but any other housekeeping or general questions about the paper?
Yes, quick question. How should we, or is this something that I could find on that APA citation format? How should we cite a person, like someone that we're interviewing?
Yeah, citing an interview. I mean, you could find it on this APA citation format. This has a lot of information that it might be overwhelming. The first thing that I probably would do is just be like to Google how to cite an interview in APA format. So you'll see here what this would look like. Okay. So here's, yeah, you can search for it. Here's an example. Here's the structure, the last name, the year, the month, the date, the interview type, whether it was an email, personal interview. Most of you will be doing personal interviews or phone interviews. And yeah, the idea here is that I'm not going to be super nitpicky about, oh, the dot was here and not here, but I do want you to properly cite all of your sources. And if you're talking about an in-text citation, you will just say, put the quotes from the person and then write personal interview and then the date that the interview happened. And then when it comes to the work cited, you can use this format here.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, very welcome. All right, so let's get talking about Malthus. I need to switch my screens again. Okay, so let's do, I want to show active speaker. I want to show myself, okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit in terms of review. Can anybody help me out with Malthus's principle of population? What is the basic statement?
Populations grow at a geometric rate, I guess exponentially, and food supply is numerical?
Yeah, well, he says arithmetic, right? Yeah. So that, you know, population grows exponentially or geometrically, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, not geometrically, exponentially. And food production only grows arithmetically, 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. More simply put, population growth is always going to outstrip food production. And the second part that I need you to remember is, what does he say is the consequence of this so-called law, this natural law?
vices such as birth control and abortions and homosexuality.
Yes, vice, meaning that people will find ways to still meet their biological sexual urges, but without wanting to make more kids, right? So they'll turn to homosexuality or birth control, which was seen as a vice alongside abortion. But really, in terms of other forms of misery, what type of misery or social consequence did he identify as the outcome of the law?
It would increase more poverty, and then the upper class would have to pay more
Yes.
for the
And
taxes.
Yes.
also more starvation.
Yes. Yes, good. That you're getting at it. But just to be really extra clear, the result of the principle of population, he argues, this is his quote unquote scientific argument, that food production will always be outstripped by population production, and that this will lead to famine and to vice. Okay, and that was a great set of examples of what he meant by vice. So basically what Malthus is doing here is he is coming up with a so-called scientific law to explain that famine is not the product of bad policy or unequal distribution of resources, but famine is the result of some quote unquote natural law. Okay. Now, tell me a little bit about when Malthus wrote The Principle of Population. Did the politics of the day influence his argument at all?
Yeah.
All right, come on, guys, help me out. Yeah, right. So tell me a little bit about the enclosures and why we need to understand the enclosures, which took place basically from the 1700s till the early 1800s, the 18th century. Okay, why? What were the enclosures?
It was the kind of switch over from I can't think of the name. It's right on the tip of my tongue.
Feudalism?
Feudalist, yeah.
Feudalist land owning structures?
Exactly, where the commoners could kind of reside and live off of the common lands, which were then, I guess, is that where enclosures came from? They were enclosed on and became, the common lands became privatized, and they were forced into the labor market.
Yes, very good. Okay, so I'm reading in the chat that I'm cutting out. Is my connection okay?
I can hear you, but
Okay.
sure.
Okay, well, if you continue to have problems, please let me know in the chat. That's really important. Maybe, let's see if I can find a set of headphones. That might help a little bit. I think I left all my headphones at home. All right, we'll just do the best we can. Okay, yeah, so the period of the enclosures. The enclosures, we are talking about the closing off and the privatization of the common lands. And what we see here in this map, really interestingly, are the different lands that were enclosed during the period of the enclosures, okay? So you can just see at first glimpse, this map illustrates that, we're talking about the majority of land in England was privatized in this century. And Karl Marx argues that in his historical work, Capital, here we have it here. I didn't assign it to you. It's a big one. That the enclosures were an act of land dispossession for the peasantry. Tell me what he meant by that. Why were the enclosures? Mitchell, you started to get into it, but why were the enclosures an act of land dispossession?
Because I think they're called the commoners, when
Not the
they
commoners or the peasants.
they can technically stay on the land, but they didn't own the land, so they would have to. They could work, and then they would have to pay a percentage of their wages to being able to stay on the land. But technically, the land belonged to, I guess not the elite, but the wealthier
aristocracy.
class. Right.
Yeah, yeah, they are the elites, but the aristocracy is the term for that group of elites in this period of time in England. And yeah, so basically what we're talking about is the transition from a feudalistic based economy to a capitalist based economy. This is the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to the enclosures, commoners would work on the estate of an aristocrat, and they gave up a percentage of their product, of whatever they made in terms of agricultural goods. They would give, it was like sharecropping, a certain percentage of their production would be given to the Lord. But in turn, the Lord worked with the church in the estate to make sure that the commoners, the peasants, had some social safety net, okay? So this was a system of, these peasants, they didn't own the land of the estate. They worked it, and they gave up a percentage of their earnings to the landed aristocracy. But the church and the Lord would provide for people in times of hardship. And really importantly, the peasants had access to the commons as a resource, right? And the commons were these areas that you see here in red, and that these in between these large estates, there would be vacant areas of land. Not all land was privatized, and these commons would be wooded areas. They would be pastures. They would be river systems, and the commoners had access to those resources. And they would use those resources for fuel, wood, for finding game, hunting, for collecting water, for hunting, and for collecting food, grazing their animals, really importantly. So when those lands are privatized through the enclosures, this is an act of land dispossession, because now the peasants have lost, they never owned that land, but they had what we call usufruct. They had users' rights to the land, okay? So this is an example of land dispossession. And Karl Marx says that dispossessing the commoners of their lands was a precondition for capitalism and for the birth of the Industrial Revolution. Could somebody tell me why this land dispossession of the commoners really was, sort of a precondition for capitalist takeoff?
I think one thing that I don't remember his name, but the YouTube video clip yesterday, where he mentioned how the land kind of became capital when they privatized it.
Yep.
I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yep. And what about the term primitive accumulation? It has to do with this here. Okay, you're on the right track, Mitchell. Anybody else want to chime in? Why are the enclosures such a key moment in the history of capitalism?
I can take another crack at it if you want. Yeah,
no, please keep talking. Go for it. I don't want people to not listen because they're going to be put on the spot. I'm just trying to make things more interesting.
Is it because they were forced off of their land and they no longer had anywhere to live? So it was kind of, I was looking for the definition in my notes, but
yeah, okay. So I'm going to read you an excerpt from Capital. I know you have your copies with you. It's on page 875, where this is Marx's chapter on primitive accumulation. Okay, so this term, he calls the enclosures, Marx calls the enclosures primitive accumulation, the first moment of capitalist accumulation. And basically what he's saying here, folks, is that when the commoners were forced off the feudal estates and were separated from the commons, the lands that they used to have access to, it forced them from a subsistence production to a wage labor system of production, right? Because if you have access to land, if you have access to animals and to wood and to medicinal herbs, and you can graze your animals on the common lands, you can produce for yourself, right? When we talk about subsistence economies, that's what many Maya still do today, right? They're subsistence farmers. They're not selling their food for money, or they're not working on a farm for a wage for 50 cents an hour and then buying rice at the market, right? So what he's getting at here is that the transition to capitalism is predicated on the wage-labor relationship, right? You know enough about Karl Marx to know that he talks about the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And what he's talking about here is the creation of the workforce, the labor, the wage labor force, the proletariat. Okay, he's talking about how the commoners became proletariat because now they no longer had access to land to farm through the feudal estate, giving 20-25%, and they didn't have access to the rivers and the forests and all of those resources, so they were left with no other option but to go to cities to find work in the quickly growing factories. And instead of growing their own food, producing their own clothes, killing their own animals, gathering their own wood, now they had to earn a wage to buy the things that they used to produce for themselves, okay? This is a really important moment in the history of capitalism. So here, you know, you hardly ever get to sort of read some of these texts, but I want you I want to read Marx's text here for you. Okay, so he says, the capital relation, the wage-labor relation, the movement of all of these people to the cities, presupposes a complete separation between the workers and the ownership of the conditions of the realization of their own labor. So-called primitive accumulation is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistory of capitalism and of the mode of production corresponding to capital. He says the economic structure of capitalist society has grown out of the economic structure of feudal society. The dissolution of the latter set free the elements of the former. The immediate producer, the worker, could dispose of his person only after he had ceased to be bound to the soil and ceased to be the slave or serf to another person. To become a free seller of labor power, who carries his commodity wherever he can, find a market for it, he must have to escape the regime of the guilds, the rules of the apprentice, the journeyman, okay? He says, hence the historical movement which changes the producers into wage laborers appears on the one hand as an emancipation from serfdom, an emancipation from feudalism. But on the other, these newly freed men, here we are, we're to the main point here, these newly freed men become sellers of themselves after they have been robbed of all their means of production and the guarantees of existence afforded by old feudal arrangements. I'm just gonna, somebody, here we go. Okay. Unmute yourself if you want to chime in. Okay. And all the guarantees exist afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And it is this history, the history of their expropriation, the history of land dispossession, is written into the annals of mankind and letters of blood and fire. Okay, so this book is written mid-1850s, so about 50 years after Malthus. And what he's saying here is what we're trying to get at, that the dissolution of feudalism enables the transition to capitalism during this time, and that the enclosures is key to this, because people, if they have access to the commons, they don't have to move to the city and sleep in the streets and breathe in the coal and earn the wage where they used to be producers for themselves. And we talked about the example of Guatemala, of the Mayans today in Guatemala, how Rigoberta Menchú said that her family only had so little land that they couldn't produce enough food to feed themselves year round. And they did a big chunk out of the year. They were non-capitalist economies. Many indigenous people live in non-capitalist economies, right? It's barter and trade, produce for yourself. There's no exchange of money. There's no earning of a wage labor. People produce for themselves. But she said they had to go down to the coast and work in the plantations, in the cotton plantations, the sugar plantations, to earn money to buy the food that they didn't have the land to produce themselves. So Rigoberta's family is like a semi-capitalist household, engaging in capitalist production during parts of the year when they would migrate to the coast, but also engaging in subsistence production for themselves. Okay, how's the audio going, folks?
Sounds good.
Is this sounding good? Okay, so, you know, social theory 101, it's actually not social theory 101, this is social theory 401, right? And this is the photo, the cover of this book, Capital. I don't know if you can see it there, but basically it's a photo of, you know, the harsh work with the beginning of capitalism and manufacturing and all of those centers in England. So primitive accumulation is important to this story because you've got to understand why people were in such dire straits. Why was this violent and hard process? Okay, so number one, when I ask you on the exam, and I always ask an essay question, the long essay question about what was Malthus's principle of population, what were the political conditions that gave rise to his arguments, what were the immediate consequences of Malthus's principle of population, and then I always ask a question along the lines of, how is Malthus's principle of population similar to or different from the population bomb, okay, which is something that you also read about for Monday, but we didn't get to talk about it. We will today. All right, so sorry, folks. I really want you to get this concept of primitive accumulation down because this is the moment that creates the conditions for capitalist takeoff, but it is also an experience of land dispossession of the feudal serfs, which basically forces them, as Marx would say, to sell themselves, their labor, for a wage, to produce the things they used to buy the things they used to produce for themselves. Okay. So he says, he calls this primitive because it corresponds to like the first moment, the earliest moment, the conditions for capitalism. So a lot of people argue that primitive accumulation still exists, and it often exists in places like Guatemala or indigenous societies when indigenous people have their land robbed from them, and they're either by force or out of poverty have to go work in plantations to earn money to buy the things that they used to be able to produce for themselves. Okay. This gives rise, all of this hardship, the people living in the streets, and we talked quite a bit about, you know, those, we looked at images of people sleeping over ropes and, you know, renting coffins. There was just mass homelessness and dissolution and contamination and waste. The cities were horrible. And this led to this debate in Congress, right, between Pitt and Whitbread. Could somebody who feels like they could get us started sort of tell us, you know, what was Pitt arguing for and what was Whitbread arguing for? What is the 1795 Pitt and Whitbread debate in Congress?
Pitt was a capitalist, and he was definitely capitalist, and he was arguing for, I'm trying to remember, I'm reading my notes, but he was arguing against like having a social safety net for people who were impoverished, while Whitbread, he was arguing for like giving a social safety net. I remember because you told us like Pitt, he wanted to pit everybody out, and then Whitbread, he wanted to give people bread.
Yeah, you remember, it's easy. Yeah, so Pitt, so what's happening is, you know, all of this transition is happening. life in cities is really difficult, and Parliament is having to reform this law called the Act of Settlement. That was a feudal law that tied serfs, commoners, serf, peasant, and commoner, they're all the same. And this, we're using those as interchange. It tied the peasants to the feudal estate, like I was talking about, the Act of Settlement, passed in 1662. Now that law has to be lifted. Work is now in the city, and capitalism requires labor mobility, not a system of labor settlement like feudalism. Does that make sense? So they're overhauling the Act of Settlement, creating a system of labor mobility to meet the new labor demands of the Industrial Revolution. But part of the Act of Settlement made the church and the feudal lord take care of the commoners. And so as they're repealing this, they're like, well, who's going to take care of the poor people now? Right? And Pitt is like, screw them, you know? And Whitbread is like, no, 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 no. We have to provide some basic minimum wage, some basic social safety net for these people who are now living in cities. We have kids in the streets starving, and you know, so that's sort of, you got to understand, when I asked the question about Malthus, the period of the enclosures, right? The transition to capitalism, the reform and ultimately repeal of the Act of Settlement. And through the discussion about the Act of Settlement, Pitt and Whitbread are fighting, well, should we have a social safety net if we're going to repeal the Act of Settlement? We're going to repeal the old feudal way of providing a basic minimum. And Pitt's like, nope, screw them, Whitbread. I don't know who said that, but you're right. He's advocating for bread, for basic subsistence. And eventually, who wins, Pitt or Whitbread?
Whitbread.
Whitbread wins, and the Poor Laws of 1796, a year later, are passed, also called Speenamland. And then we were talking about the context of the Poor Laws, the Whitbread, you know, maybe he was an advocate for the poor, but I also think that he was interested in keeping the English political system intact. Remember what was happening, the French Revolution, the aristocracy in France literally lost their heads. The French Revolution, and there was a lot of concern that if the poverty of the masses was not alleviated, then another France would happen in England, okay? And you know, all of these factors are basically influencing this moment. So yes, the Poor Laws are passed. It's a method of giving relief to the poor based on the price of bread and the number of children that a man had, okay? So basically it's like a basic wage, you know, giving food to supplement a wage. Now, what does Malthus think of all of this? Remember, he's in Parliament at this time, right? And when does he write the Principle of Population?
He writes it in 1798 in response to the Poor Laws and response to these debates.
Exactly, right. You've got it right. Your timeline is the enclosures, the Industrial Revolution, 1795 Pitt and Whitbread debate. This is what I want you to go through in your essay, right? The period of the enclosures, the Industrial Revolution. Then you have the 1795 debate over the Act of Settlement, the repeal of the Act of Settlement, which also came with a debate about social welfare, right? And if the Lord and the parish were no longer providing social welfare, who is going to provide welfare in the city for these people? Pitt and Whitbread disagree. Whitbread wins. The Poor Laws are passed in 1796, but a lot of people in Parliament are not happy about this because the money for the Poor Laws, the funding for the subsistence, comes from taxation of the aristocracy and those people who, you know, got privatized land, got the commoners' land basically privatized. Anyway, so Malthus is very critical. And he argues that the Poor Laws, rather than solving the problem, are only going to create more problems because the principle of population states that population growth is always going to outstrip food production, right? And so there's always going to be starvation and famine. It's law, it's science, it's nature. That's how nature works. right? So by alleviating the starvation and the famine of the few today, they're just going to breed like rabbits, have more kids, and then there'll be more poor people who are hungry, etc. later on, okay? And so he writes the essay on population. Where are you, Malthus? Sorry, I had him just here for a minute ago. He writes the Principle of Population in 1798 as a response to this context, this political moment, and these welfare debates. Okay, so sorry that took a long time, but it's really important and there's a lot there. So we talked a little bit about the immediate legacies within the next sort of 100 years of Malthus, was that the Spienemann laws are repealed and new poor laws are put into place in 1834 that basically criminalizes paupers and poverty. And rather than giving out food as a form of welfare, poverty is criminalized. And people are sent to workhouses to sort of earn their keep, right? But these are more like modeled after prisons, and there's a lot of literature on that. We talked about the Irish potato famine and how that was also related to British colonial policy and the Industrial Revolution, and the Indian famine at the turn of the century. All right, so here it is. Malthus's Principle of Population, rather than being objective science, is a political argument about the defense of private property, right? The famine and the hardship of the commoners was not a result of the enclosures, it's a result of their inability to control their sexual reproduction. They have too many kids, okay? It naturalizes the difference between rich and poor. Whenever we have scientific racism or science being misused to defend power relations, we're seeing what is called a naturalization. It's taken out of the social and put into the realm of science or biology. It makes people not have to be responsible for what happens in society because it's nature. And, you know, first and foremost, this is an anti-welfare argument on the part of Malthus. All right, I think it was Alex who said that these arguments of Malthus reminded her of eugenics. And you did your reading today on the Malthus Factor, which is a really, really great text. And it talks about how, yes, Malthus's work was a defense of private property. It was used to critique welfare reform, and most certainly, one of Malthus's more recent legacies, eugenics, which we talked about earlier on in the class, it has what we call Malthusian tendencies, right? So I'm reading Ross on page 5. It's not surprising that Malthusianism, Malthus's ideas, found an intellectual ally a century later in eugenics. Malthus's theory had always presumed that the poor were not equals of the more privileged, that one of the reasons that the poor have too many children is that they lacked middle-class virtues and moral constraint, such as prejudice, foresight, self-discipline, and the capacity to manage their own affairs, okay? In the second half of the 19th century, eugenics took this thinking a step further by arguing that the overpopulous poor's moral deficiencies were innate, biological, that they couldn't be changed, okay? So eugenics builds on Malthus's ideas by saying that, yes, the poor are not equal to the rich and the privileged. And of course, eugenics was about not just comparing class, as Malthus was doing in England, but now race, right? And saying that this lack of moral restraint, this lack of intellectual rational ability to reduce their sexual urges in the context of famine, that this is biological inferiority, okay? And we know sort of how that plays out. Now, what about the Green Revolution? Who has done any research on the Green Revolution or could tell me a little bit about it? Or has even heard of it before?
I know vaguely that it was
Yeah, what do you think of when you hear green revolution?
Well, it sounds really good, kind of like pro environment, and that's what I used to think of. It was kind of, I guess, almost. Well, sorry, I'm mouthful. They kind of made these developed, got air quotes, countries dependent upon like certain seeds, bioengineered seeds, in order to produce high yields and utilize like all of their fields. But it was really kind of like an underlying motive of being able to like have cheap labor and goods from these countries while keeping them like out of the trade loop.
Yeah. Yes. Good. Who else has something to say about the Green Revolution? Have you heard of it? Anybody else besides Mitchell heard of it? Or is this the first time?
I've heard of it, but I had no idea what it was. I was planning on Googling it after class, actually. So it's good that you're going through it.
Yeah, good. Yeah, okay, so when we think about these more contemporary legacies of Malthus, right? What does Malthus argue? That famine is a product of the principle of population, right? So if you want to reduce famine, you need to produce more food to deal with this principle. But we were talking last time in lecture that there's enough food to feed the world. There's enough, there's something like, what's the percentage of food that's thrown away in America on a daily basis? It's a big percentage, and a lot of food is wasted. There's enough food to feed the people who live on this planet, but it's about who has access to that food, the unequal distribution of resources that often produces famine, right? Rather than just a lack of sheer volumes of food, which is what Malthus's ideas assert. And so the Green Revolution is very much a product of Malthus's thinking. And it's also a product of the moment of international development. Remember, we were talking about international development at the beginning of the semester. And we said after World War II, first world countries went to third world countries, and they were going to bring first world capitalist technologies, modernization, industrialization to the third world to solve their problem of poverty. Okay, remember that? So part of this project of development, partly influenced by Malthus's ideas that famine is a result of overpopulation, right? That too many people produces famine rather than the distribution of resources and power. This gives birth to the project, the Green Revolution. And it sounds like it's not the way that you think of green today in terms of being environmentally sustainable. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Green was meant in terms of making
money,
crops green, growing green. What is this a picture of? Pastures, green production, blooming, growth, more production, more increasing yields, producing more food. And so this starts as an agricultural program funded by the Rockefellers as part of this development initiative. And basically some money went in to basically bring sort of biotechnology to the so-called third world. The idea was that if you wanted to solve poverty and hunger in the third world, of course, third world agriculture had to industrialize like the US, right? You follow the US, you follow the same path. And so what we had was basically the importation and implementation of large-scale agro-industrial agriculture in the third world to increase the amount of food that's produced. So what does this mean? It means that there's this scientific project. We're going to see a clip, I hope it works, of Norman Borlaug, who is the father of the Green Revolution in the 40s and the 50s. And he went around the world taking hybrid seeds that had been bioengineered to make them shorter, more resistant to pests, less likely to bend over and fall in rain and wind, and sort of genetically engineered, ultimately would genetically engineer these seeds, and then they would take these seeds and go to India or to Mexico and say, here, use these seeds. We have improved them. We have manufactured splicing and dicing through genetics, plant genetics. We have made a seed, a corn seed or a wheat seed that produces more and is less resistant to drought, less resistant to pest infestation. But our new agriculture system requires irrigation. It requires pesticides. It requires fertilizers, right? So this is what I'm talking about, sort of first world agro-industrial production is brought to the third world. And so what we see on the ground is, yes, many places like Mexico and India switched to these seeds, these new genetically modified seeds that were that would produce more, that were more resistant. But the problem is, of course, that this had a lot of transformations on the ground that were both negative and positive. But let's look at some of the successes of the Green Revolution, and then we'll watch the video to really help you get this information down. So the Green Revolution, we're talking about the period from the 1940s to the 1970s, okay? And it was the export of these seeds that were produced in first world countries that were supposed to yield more to the third world, but it also came with a development package, building irrigation, building the infrastructure. Food yields did increase dramatically. In India, for example, yield per unit of farmland improved by more than 30% between 1947 and 1979. Increased food production, 30%. That's great, right? And also because this is, largely integrated into a global economy of agro-industrial production, the idea is that, again, a country specializes in the food stuff that they're good at, and then they can export that and trade. And so there's the development through the Green Revolution and a lot of exporting of food processing. Hydroelectric dams have to be built, right, to pump the irrigation systems. There were jobs and factories that were created. But you're going to see here shortly that the Green Revolution also had some negative downsides. Well, first and foremost, one of the biggest problems with the Green Revolution is that all of those pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers have taken a toll on the environment. Okay, so with the Green Revolution in third world countries, there was also an increase in environmental degradation and contamination, particularly of water supplies. And a lot of water actually was diverted to these new, huge, large-scale crops, and that meant less, oftentimes, clean water, because now the water has, we have nutrient pollution and all sorts of pesticides and all of that getting into the water. Another critique of the Green Revolution has been that a lot of farmers have gone into debt. Has anybody heard about the farmer suicide phenomenon in India? We've got a small group here, but has anybody heard about the large-scale suicides with farmers in India?
I read an article about it, and it was a couple semesters ago, so I'm not.
Yeah, it was, and probably, maybe you have heard of this, and actually farmers have the highest rate of suicide of many professions, I think of any profession, but one of the top in the United States as well. And part of it is that farmers go into a lot of debt, to engage in this large-scale agro-industrial production rather than like small-scale or even subsistence farming, right? And so what's happened is, a lot of farmers have gone heavily in debt, pursuing this dream and this development vision of the Green Revolution. And that actually has led, unfortunately, to a lot of suicides, particularly in India, which is sort of the ground zero of the Green Revolution. Another really interesting thing, and dang, this goes all the way back to the potato famine in Ireland. There was a decrease in gene diversity. Okay, so now in India and Mexico, rather than keeping their own seeds that they'd had for thousands of years and maybe trying out different seeds and planting a little of this here and a little of this here and a little bit of that, it's just the one seed, the one seed, the one seed that's planted. So there's a loss of genetic diversity as people are only planting Monsanto seeds instead of the seeds that their ancestors had been collecting and harvesting for thousands of years. Has anybody heard of Monsanto?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Monsanto funded, is a big player here in the Green Revolution. Monsanto produces patented Green Revolution seeds. And this is what we're getting at here with the commodification of the seed as well. And this is one of the big critiques of the Green Revolution, because rather than farmers in India being able to collect seeds from last year's harvest, whether it be wheat or rice, right? Save those seeds and then use those seeds for the next year's harvest. Actually, the genetically modified Green Revolution seeds have a kill gene inserted into their DNA so that they do not reproduce seeds that can be collected and planted the next year. So the farmer, and these are patented technologies, so the farmer now has to go to Monsanto and buy seeds every year. So this is a commodification of the seed. And there's this brilliant, brilliant, brilliant book. If I can put my finger on it. If anybody is interested in this, and this goes all the way back to Linnaeus. It's always full circle, people. This book, First the Seed, I've assigned it in the past to different folks, but I would love to talk to you about this if you're interested. The Political Economy of Plant Biotechnology. This tells the story of how Linnaeus and his disciples, and the people who came after them in the 1800s, they went to third world countries and they collected seeds. They collected specimens, right? That's what the botanists were doing through colonialism. So what's bizarre and really unjust is that the very seeds that were sliced and diced in the laboratory in New York and then were sold to Indian farmers or to Peruvian farmers, the genetic basis of those patented seeds were collected through colonialism, and thus, basically, what the Green Revolution is doing is selling third world farmers genetically modified versions of their own original land races that were collected over colonial exploration, okay? And so basically what they're saying here, what Kloppenberg is saying is that it's really unfair for Monsanto to be forcing Indian farmers or Mexican farmers to buy these seeds, because the very genetic material that they used to produce those seeds came from those countries. So this is sort of what we're getting at with I get all worked up and I don't have anybody to keep me here in check. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to try to show you this video, and I'm going to keep up my Zoom chat and I'm going to see if we can watch it together. It's just 5 minutes. It's going to bring the Green Revolution to life, and it's actually a pro-Green Revolution video. And I also want you to see how clearly Malthus's principle of population was used to justify this project since its inception. Okay, so let's see if we can do this. Wish me good luck, folks. I'm going to do share screen. I think it's going to be here. Okay. All right. Can you all see the video?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So go ahead and just sort of let me know or chime in if this doesn't work, but hopefully we can watch this together.
More than half the farmers of the world live in a subsistence agriculture outside of the economies of their own country. They have had very little or no money with which to make purchases of the many items that you need for a decent life.
In the early 1900s, projections showed that the world would have over 6 billion people to support by the 21st century. With most of the population predicted to surge in underdeveloped nations, there was an increasing fear of world famine. While population grows geometrically, agriculture is only able to grow at a linear rate. There were hungry mouths to feed, and there was no possible way to feed the entire population with the resources at hand. Agriculture needed a transformation. While the world was facing great turmoil and strife, the father of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, was fighting a different kind of battle, the battle against world hunger. His weapon of choice? Biotechnology. The Green Revolution began in 1943 when plant geneticist Norman Borlaug and a team of researchers arrived on Mexican soil. His goal was to improve agricultural techniques and biotechnological methodologies, which in turn would help alleviate starvation and improve the living quality of developing nations. Creating new genetically modified strains of wheat, rice, maize, and other crops, Borlaug planned to win the battle against world hunger. The hope was that these new crops and farming techniques would rescue third world countries from the brink of starvation. That's exactly what happened. The agricultural innovations brought to the poverty-stricken countries gave the farmers the skills and resources necessary to sustain themselves. This triggered a chain of events that would allow these once struggling nations to survive. Agricultural exports soared in quantity and diversity and allowed the countries to become self-sufficient. As the genetically modified crops thrived, farmers were able to use their increased income to purchase newer and superior farming machinery. This increase in revenue made farming easier, more reliable, and more efficient. The Green Revolution led to the modernization of agriculture and has had a profound social, economic, and political impact on the world. The Mexican government turned to the Rockefeller Foundation in their endeavor to nourish Mexico through agriculture. Borlaug was hired as the director of the Cooperative Wheat Research and Production Program and worked tirelessly to create a food source that was high yield, disease resistant, and pest resistant. A major breakthrough in crop research came from the development of dwarf plants.
A gene was introduced into them that made them shorter. And by being shorter, they could respond to higher rates of soil nutrients, fertilizers, and grow a more robust plant that wouldn't fall over and be unharvestable by the farmer. So this dwarf trait was one of the revolutionary changes that happened in the varieties that farmers grew.
Tall plants would fall over or break with heavy use of fertilizers or fierce wind and rain. Dwarf plants are more durable, resistant to disease, protected from insects, and produce a higher yield. In 1943, Mexico was forced to import about half of its wheat. Within 13 years of using the techniques developed by Borlaug, Mexico was completely self-sufficient. Just 8 years later, Mexico was exporting 500,000 tons of wheat per year. After his success in Mexico, Borlaug traveled to India and Pakistan in 1961 to help their famine-threatened communities. India and Pakistan were two of the countries that were most at risk for the population boom, and the people were suffering starvation and malnutrition. They lacked the agricultural manpower to sustain their populations at the time, let alone their projected population by the 21st century. Even with the promise of success, the Green Revolution did not progress smoothly at first.
The biggest struggle was probably in getting farmers to trust the scientists. Farmers were used to trusting themselves, to doing what they were accustomed to, being responsible for their own seed. And in the Green Revolution, they had to be willing to try seeds that were generated from somebody that they didn't know. And they needed to be convinced that these scientists were on the right path.
After gaining the confidence of the country's inhabitants, Borlaug applied his biotechnological innovations toward developing new strains of rice.
This brings new hope. If we can keep this so-called Green Revolution alive, there is a hope that it will generate a whole new rhythm within their internal economies. This is our hope.
The result? an increase from 2 tons of wheat crops per hectare in the 1960s to triple that amount, 6 tons of wheat per hectare by the 1990s. This success was not only seen in wheat, but in other crops such as rice. India today has become one of the most successful rice producers in the world, exporting around 4.5 million tons in 2006. Borlaug trained local agronomists and scientists to carry on his work and to continue innovating new advancements. The Green Revolution team spread their knowledge of biotechnology to numerous hungry nations, including China, South Vietnam, Brazil, and Turkey. These agricultural innovations helped save the lives of millions, if not billions, of people across the globe. As with all scientific research, there were some unexpected consequences that arose as a result of the Green Revolution. Some environmentalists from developed nations in the West have a particularly harsh view of the products and techniques developed by Borlaug. Genetically modified crops use a combination of pesticides, organic and synthetic fertilizers, and irrigation. Environmentalists worry about the effect this long-term usage of chemicals will have on the environment. Additionally, more water is needed to support the crops in this area because of the poor soil quality. Some say this large use of resources is irresponsible. Due to inefficient irrigation, some of the pesticides and fertilizers percolate into the water supply. This damages the fragile balance of life in the rivers and lakes and pollutes the already diminished supply of drinking water the people have. Irrigation methods are soaking up a lot of the fresh water available in the land. There have been a few cases of birth defects that some theorize might be a result of the tainted water. Unfortunately, in order to feed starving nations, all of these techniques are necessary. People need to eat, and with the poor quality of the soil that plagues less developed countries, there really is no other alternative at this point. Despite the setbacks, the Green Revolution has done more to help the starving people of the world than any other project before it. Along with increasing crop yields, Borlaug bred these designer crops to have desirable qualities. Some strains of wheat were modified to have a high protein level to compensate for a lack of protein in their diet. This was incredibly important in areas where communities didn't have the finances to purchase meat. By breeding different strains of crops for desired attributes, agronomists were also able to create strains that were resistant to lethal plant diseases. Another advantage built into the high-yield crops is that farmers are able to produce more food on less land. This has saved millions of acres of rainforest and grassland from destruction. A new green revolution is on the horizon. With today's improved understanding of both science and cultural constructs, there is much work to be done. Over the years, we have discovered that preventing starvation does not come from solely teaching the people to farm. It comes from helping the country as a whole. Improving the infrastructure of third world countries should be a priority. Building roadways for transportation of goods, along with developing new irrigation methods, is crucial for economic advancement. Also, by finding a common ground between environmentalists and agronomists, we will be able to better protect the environment and save lives simultaneously. Both sides need to be aware of the importance of working together to create a better future for all.
Norman Borlaug left behind a big legacy.
Okay. So what did you all think of that video?
I didn't realize that third world countries had such bad soil.
I know there's some interesting tidbits, and you see sort of that narrative of development that the discourse of development on how powerful that is, how that sort of also combines with the Malthusian arguments, right? That people in third world countries are poor either because they have poor environments or because they just don't have the technological know-how to solve their problems, right?
Yeah.
Other comments or thoughts? Has anybody heard about some of these debates with Monsanto in the United States about the commodification of the seed?
Yeah. I listened to a podcast about, I guess they had a bioengineered soy plant that was resistant to certain bacteria that was really plaguing soy farmers. And so X amount of soy farmers started using them, but it was very volatile and would travel in the air, even when apparently applied correctly, which would kill a bunch of plants in the area. And they're getting sued big time, but they'll probably.
Several farmers are being sued by Monsanto, and I think it's like Food Inc. and some podcasts have covered sort of the implications of the commodification of seeds in the United States. And of course, you know, this video talks about mostly third world countries. How did you see Malthus being marshaled in that video?
That's just like a lot of white saviorism. Like, these bigger countries are supposed to come in and they're supposed to make everything better, but then they kind of just like enter a cycle of dependence. And while they are getting some of the help they need, they're now forced to basically just stay in these contracts that are ruining their land and also possibly harming their people.
And did you see literally the graph at the beginning where it's like, because population growth always outstrips food production, right? Did you see that graph at the beginning of the video?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, how much more that's Malthus's argument, Malthus's principle of population. And while it's interesting to be thinking about the use of genetically modified seeds and the ability of using science to address the world's problem, has the Green Revolution solved the problem of world hunger?
No.
Yeah. Why? Despite all of the dramatic increases in yields in places like India and Mexico, why in places like Guatemala today, where the Green Revolution was also implemented, why are 50% of people chronically malnourished?
You can't afford to buy the product that's being grown in their own country, and they don't really get access to it.
Yeah, and what's happened a lot is that we've had sort of rising land prices. We have basically small scale farmers being pushed out of farm production in these economies that are industrializing food production. And so it's important to remember that just because a country is exporting food doesn't mean that all of the people are being fed, right? That might be an economic development strategy that's separate from a poverty alleviation strategy.
That's what I read some time ago. It was generally some farmers in India that were subsistence farmers, and then the Green Revolution happened, and they were given these seeds, and then eventually they were given, they realized that they could grow certain crops and export them and get more money, and they stopped growing things that they really used altogether, and were just exporting.
Yeah, and just since we're segueing to the environment here, now that third world countries have transitioned to agro-industrial food production like we have in the United States, what implication does this have for the environment? I mean, we talked a little bit about the fact that these genetically modified seeds require pesticides and fertilizers and irrigation. That's one huge environmental impact. But also, now that food production has gone global, we also want to be thinking about the implications for climate change and for energy usage, right? A lot of people who are trying to buy local in their own communities, buy local food. And I'm going to jump ahead here. Sorry to do this here. I want to just get to this slide. You like my Bud Light advertising? And this is probably going to come back and haunt me in terms of me getting more Bud Light advertising. So what's interesting is, back in the 40s and the 50s, it was all about the Green Revolution. But now today we have come almost entirely full circle. And powerful organizations, international organizations like the United Nations, by no means, shape, or form as a largely critical anti-development, anti-capitalist organization. It's not. But basically, we haven't sort of this about face with how people think the world should be fed. And now we're having a major push, not only in countries like ours, but in third world countries where small scale organic local production is being advocated, both to sort of help meet this need of, yes, food and getting people a diversity of foods and healthy foods, but also for the environmental implications of not having every grain of rice travel from India to the supermarket at HEB, or thinking about the use of all of those fertilizers. Okay, so now this is a really important point, folks. And this takes us back to the reading that we did for Monday. Okay. What happens with the population bomb in 1960s? 1968 is when the population bomb was written. Malthus's arguments that overpopulation creates famine get reworked to solve a new problem, environmental degradation. So if I was to ask you, how many of you think that overpopulation creates environmental degradation? Your belief, your assumption that that statement is true is coming from this idea, the population bomb, and how Malthus's idea, his equation that overpopulation causes famine, got repurposed in the 1960s to overpopulation creates environmental degradation. So in your essay question for the final exam, when I ask you what is similar and different between Malthus's principle of population and Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, I want you to say that they're both blaming overpopulation for the world's problems, right? But Malthus is saying that famine is a result. Ehrlich is saying overpopulation causes environmental degradation. And it wasn't just Paul Ehrlich. There was another man named Garrett Harding who published in a very prominent journal called Science, also in the year 1968, who was basically saying that overpopulation was causing environmental degradation because there were all of these common pooled resources like fishing or forests, and that overpopulation was threatening those commons. We still have commons today, right? Those are resources that haven't been privatized, like the air at this point hasn't been commodified. Water is now being commodified, traditionally thought of as a commons. Greenhouse gases, right? All of these. So we see in the 1960s, both through this argument in Science that was titled The Tragedy of the Commons, and here Harding is making the argument for commodifying and privatizing everything as a way to protect against overusage. We see this Malthusian argument being applied once again. Okay, so does everybody understand what I'm wanting you to get out there? Yeah. All right, okay. I've got one more video that I want to watch a clip of with you today. I'm going to watch just a few minutes, and then I'm going to let you finish it on your own, and we're going to come back to what's with the rest of happening with the rest of the lecture. Okay, so we'll see here if I can get myself together. Dan's going to fix that for me. Okay, so the population bomb. All right, so this is a 12-minute video produced by the New York Times in 2015, following up on the population bomb. Oh, sorry, I didn't share my screen properly. Okay, so we'll watch just a few moments of this together because it really sets up the remaining sort of 5 or 10 minutes that we have for lecture.
Overpopulation, so long predicted, has stolen upon us. It's getting worse week by week.
In the 1960s, a new kind of fear began to spread across America.
The U.S. could be busting out at the seams by the end of the century. If we do not, by humane means, limit our numbers, then numbers are going to be limited by more famines and shortages and consequent social conflicts.
The idea that human population was outstripping the Earth's ability to support mankind was was a powerful one, and in the hands of one man.
Population growth will kill you stone cold dead.
The message reached a wider audience than ever before. But what became of the population bomb?
How many years do you have to not have the world end to decide that it didn't end because that reason was wrong?
Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich didn't start out as a prophet of doom. His area of study focused on butterflies. But after visiting the crowded streets of Delhi, he had a realization.
If we continue to let population grow, and if we continue to exploit the underdeveloped countries, if we continue to pollute the seas with a wide variety of compounds and so on, it's very difficult for me to picture things holding together for more than another decade or so.
The basic point is so simple. We have a finite planet with finite resources, and in such a system, you can't have infinite population growth.
Ehrlich laid out his hypothesis in a slim volume called The Population Bomb. It was a call to action for many, including a student Ehrlich advised, Stuart Brand.
There's too many people, and we'd like to see people have fewer children and better ones. The whole idea that people make more people who make more people until there's too many people, and by then it's too late, that's a very persuasive argument.
Adrienne Germain, a young women's health advocate, found herself drawn to Ehrlich as well, due to his support of birth control.
The message was that we were already in a crisis, and if we didn't have urgent and immediate action, the world would simply destroy itself.
Look at what the year 2000 will be. Our cities are going to be choked with people. They're going to be choked with traffic. They're going to be choked with crime. They're going to be choked with pollution. And they will be impossible places in which to live.
Paul's picture of doom and gloom looked real.
Net world population is increasing by 23 people every 10 seconds. It's clear that world population growth remains completely out of control.
I bought it totally. Many of my friends bought it totally. I organized an event for 60 people to starve in public.
What are you trying to prove? It's about pain in the world. Maybe anybody who's thinking of having a third child ought to go hungry a week.
The mode became, don't have kids. There's enough of them in the world. And if your friends have kids, it's fine if they feel uncomfortable about that.
We had formed an organization called Zero Population Growth. And then Johnny took me on The Tonight Show.
Would you welcome Dr. Paul Ehrlich?
You have to get the death rate and birth rate in balance. And there's only two ways to do it. One is to bring the birth rate down. The other is to push the death rate up. I did the show maybe 20 times. And we went from 6 chapters and 600 members to 600 chapters and 60,000 members.
We're starting in now. This is the first step.
The Bagleys belong to a growing number of young marrieds who favor ZPG, zero population growth.
How many children do you have? 2 children.
Ehrlich's views on how to bring the birth rate down were concrete. Compulsion if voluntary methods fail. Creating a blacklist of people, companies, and organizations impeding population control in the U.S. Responsibility prizes for childless marriages. A tax on children. And a luxury tax on diapers and cribs.
Concerns about population became misanthropic. And it was taken with so much seriousness that Paul Ehrlich could recommend things like putting stuff in public water that would make people not as fertile.
Panic is not too strong a word to use for some of the advocates that I referred to as true believers.
It was a zeitgeist that was taking shape.
Attention, all citizens. Childbearing is herewith forbidden.
One of the things about zeitgeist is they have astonishing durability.
It appears that large families are on the way out, and ZPG may be possible.
The idea also took hold in the developing world, where governments like India's had already begun to embrace population control.
The core message of the book, population growth outstripping food supply, resonated quite a bit with India's elites, with the middle classes. They much preferred to believe that the poor were poor because of too many children, rather than being poor because of an unfair and unequal economic system.
If you start with that problem definition, then it's almost inevitable that there will be circumstances where governments and other actors will act in a way that is coercive.
In the mid-1970s, the Indian government began a controversial effort to encourage mass sterilization.
We do want to create an atmosphere in which people realize the importance of this program.
It led to abuses. Access to food aid and housing were sometimes used as coercion. Others weren't even given a choice.
More than 8 million sterilizations were performed, many forcibly. The people, in the words of one family planning expert, were treated like cattle.
Several days ago, crowds formed to protest being sterilized. The police opened fire and killed at least 50 of them.
Zero population growth is a tragic frame in the sense that it was assumed that there was no way out, that people would just go on reproducing until there really was a desperate circumstance in the world.
Ehrlich's message could be summed up in a dramatic prediction.
Sometime in the next 15 years, the end will come. And by the end, I mean an utter breakdown of the capacity of the planet to support humanity.
Predictions do not necessarily come true. The critics go in and look at these little stories that won't come true. And when they didn't come true, say, Ehrlich was wrong. I was recently criticized because I had said many years ago that I would bet that England wouldn't exist in the year 2000. Well, England did exist in the year 2000, but that was only 14 years ago.
But Ehrlich says it could still be just a matter of time.
One of the things that people don't understand is that timing to an ecologist is very, very different from timing to an average person.
How many years do you have to not have the world end to decide that whatever reason you thought the world was going to end, that actually maybe it didn't end because that reason was wrong?
Ehrlich predicted that by the 1970s, India would be starving. Quite to the contrary. The Green Revolution came to India with a big bang and a boom in such a rapid way that India has never looked back.
Although an estimated 3 million children around the world still die of malnutrition every year, the Green Revolution's farming technology helped lessen rates of hunger in the developing world over the decades, even as the world's population skyrocketed.
I know Paul Ehrlich reasonably well, and I respect him as a biologist. I don't and never have, and he knows it, agreed with his views on population. There's a tendency to apply to human beings the same sort of models that may apply for the insect world. The difference, of course, is that human beings are conscious beings, and we do all kinds of things to change our destiny.
Paul Ehrlich saw a density of people that frightened him, but with time we've been able to look past the car window into what's actually going on with the demographics of the people who live there, and they're not having so many kids, and that's changed the whole story.
That story is playing out today in parts of India. In growing cities like Chennai in the south, large families, once needed for farming, are no longer always seen as the key to success.
Previously, my father used to have 4 children, and my grandfather used to have 7 children. But the things have changed. Even myself, I have only 2 children. Even my sister is having only 1 kid, because now education becomes the first priority here.
Kamal Sharma takes time off from work to walk his 3 children home from school in the northern city of Patna, where he lives with his wife, Seema Devi.
मेरे लिए 3 बच्चे बहुत काफी है. मेरे हस्बैंड का सैलरी भी कम है.
Devi made her own choice to limit her family size, unlike in the 1970s, when some people were forcibly sterilized. Although the national policy has changed, pressure to meet unofficial sterilization targets remains in many areas of the country, and sometimes turns sterilization surgery into a dangerous assembly line.
We're told that 83 women were operated upon in a span of just 6 hours by a single doctor.
But increasingly, the government is finding that fertility rates can be reduced in other ways. For example, a prioritization of maternal health in clinics like this one in Medavakam has lowered infant mortality, making families more responsive to the government's message.
The population bomb was defused by urbanization, by people getting out of poverty all over the world, by having enough to eat so you didn't have multiple children in the hopes that some of them would survive. It's somewhat ironic that what Paul Ehrlich saw as a horrible, hellish vision of the future is what turned the population bomb upside down.
Brand says that Ehrlich did succeed in raising awareness about important issues, such as the destructive effect population growth can have on the environment, even if some of his predictions didn't come to pass.
If you ask me the question, are there things that I have written in the past that I wouldn't write today? The answer is certainly yes. I've expressed more certainty because I was trying to bring people to get something done.
But his core message remains the same today. There are nearly 4 billion more people in the world, and they are consuming more resources than ever before.
I do not think my language is too apocalyptic in the population bomb. My language would be even more apocalyptic today. The idea that every woman should have as many babies as she wants is, to me, exactly the same kind of idea as everybody ought to be permitted to throw as much of their garbage into their neighbor's backyard as they want.
But if the world were to succeed in its decades-old task to curb population growth, what then?
What if large population is not bad, but is good?
What many more countries are already trying to come to terms with is aging of the population.
Japan needs more women to have children. The fertility rate's low. The population is getting older and shrinking.
America's in the midst of a baby bust.
China is hoping for a new baby boom.
While certain population hotspots remain a concern, largely in areas with the scarcest resources, much of the world is now grappling with the flip side of the population bomb.
The point at which population peaks, around 9 billion in the 2040s or 50s, the story will not be, oh my God, we got 9 billion people. How horrible. It'll be, oh my God, we're running out of people.
Okay. All right, what do you think of the video?
That was good.
There was a lot there, right?
That was a little wonky, but in the beginning he mentioned that it's not sustainable to keep exploiting these countries, and that was some good sense.
That was some good sense. But you know, I'm just sort of like resonating with what we sort of take to as our common sense truth, what we take as powerful fact, right? This idea that overpopulation is causing environmental degradation, and you sort of see these legacies of Malthus, and part of the problem here, and I want to be very clear, is that that while it is really important to be thinking about women's reproductive rights, we want to be thinking about women's reproductive rights as a human rights issue rather than as an overpopulation issue, right? So the film showed that this discourse of overpopulation led to 8 million sterilizations in India in the 1970s. And this is clearly a violation of people's human rights to engage in that type of activity. And this is precisely the type of interventions that were undertaken in many third world countries in response to this so-called problem. Now, I think we saw Gita Sen. She's a super famous scholar, the woman who was critiquing Ehrlich. Why does she say that the middle and upper classes of India were so happy to believe this narrative of overpopulation causing famine and environmental degradation? Why does that discourse resonate so powerfully with the middle class and the elite?
Because it basically takes the blame off of them if they can put it on somebody else, people that are having more children because they don't necessarily have access to proper means of contraception, while upper and elite classes, they have access to those means.
Yeah, good. Anybody else want to chime in? What did you remember what she says? Yes, that's exactly right. And I think of that one sentence she says in particular. She says that the middle classes and upper classes in India would much rather believe that famine and poverty are a result of overpopulation than an unjust economic system, right? And in many ways, that's what this narrative of overpopulation does. It blames poor third world peoples for the environmental problems facing the world today. And while we're blaming those people who have too many kids, who can't control their reproduction despite the fact that they can't provide for themselves, it lets everybody else, us, off the hook. What role do economic systems play in producing environmental degradation, in producing famine? Okay, so when, you know, and this goes all the way back to Foucault, and because I'm here in my office, we can bring Foucault here. What does Foucault say, people?
Knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power. The person who defines the problem has immense power. So if the problem is a lack of capitalist development, right, then the solution is development. If the problem is overpopulation, then the solution is controlling women's bodies and fertility. But what might be an alternative narrative about environmental degradation? What about the role of consumption? This graph here comes from the World Bank, certainly a mainstream economic organization, that's showing the share of the consumption of the world's resources. The richest 20% of the world, which includes myself and perhaps you, we consume nearly 77% of all of the world's resources. The world's middle 60% consume just 20%, and the world's poorest 20% on the planet only consume 1.5% of the world's resources. So, you know, the whole problem with this overpopulation narrative is that it diverts attention away from the role that consumption and our consumption of environmental resources in our daily life contributes to environmental degradation. Check this out. Here's per capita use of water, and this is cubic meters per year. So in Mali, a person uses 4 cubic meters per year. In France, which is a developed country, people live longer in France than they do in the United States. That might be an indicator for quality of life. In France, people consume less than half of the water here in the United States, okay? So one person is not, in terms of their impact on the environment, living in China, living in France, living in the United States, have different impacts on the environment. So consumption needs to be part of our explanation in terms of world resources. Here's another way of looking at average water use per day. This is a graph that shows meat consumption. And after Luxembourg, the United States has the highest per capita consumption of meat, which is, you know, way higher than if you look at sort of other developed countries. Here's Japan, here's the UK, France, Spain and Australia. Look at all the way down here in India. Supposedly all of those Indians that were overpopulating, they consume a small fraction of the amount of meat that Americans do. And yes, that's a reflection of poverty, among other things, but also lifestyle and culture, because poverty certainly wouldn't, you know, policy and culture explain a lot of the differences within developed countries. And could somebody tell me why beef in particular is so bad for the environment? Why is why do people argue that if you want to save the planet, you should eat less beef?
Because and methane production.
Because, too bad I'm not at home. My kids would be laughing at that explanation, but it's certainly right. What else about the methane besides methane? It makes beef sort of a really unsustainable production.
Water usage.
Water usage, yes. And what else?
A lot of land has to be cleared in order for the cattle to graze and be slaughtered later on. So
yeah, cows need a lot of pasture, right? And cattle production is driving deforestation in many parts of the world. And so, yes, it's cattle, it's the conversion of rainforest or forest to pasture, the amount of water that goes into keeping that pasture as a food source. And if you think about the amount of resources that it takes to produce, like calories per beef is just not good for the environment. So we want to be thinking in more complex ways about what's driving environmental degradation. And, you know, of course, CO2 emissions, also when we think about our atmosphere as a global commons that we all should be taking care of. Certainly, the Western wealthy countries, in particularly North America and Australia, are contributing way more per capita in terms of pollution, which of course contributes to climate change. So just to wrap up, folks, the problem with all of these Malthusian approaches, whether we're talking about Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb, whether we're talking about Malthus himself and the moment that he was writing his arguments, is that they distract us from focusing on the role that consumption plays in environmental degradation and famine, okay? And by consumption, I also mean the power relations and policies, right, that enable certain people to consume more resources than others. Now, you will get a question on the essay that will ask you something like, you know, I don't have the exam, the past exam, but when I'm sort of asking you to walk through Malthus, the political context that motivated his essay, and how Malthus's explanation is different than Paul Ehrlich, I'm going to ask you to reflect your own opinion on whether or not overpopulation contributes to environmental degradation. And, you know, while you might be thinking that I'm sort of advocating against thinking about overpopulation and focusing only on consumption, you know, the most nuanced answers have really given me complex sort of working through the relationship between population and consumption. So just be prepared that you'll probably get a question like that that asks you to sort of think through these debates yourself and to give your own opinion. Another critique of Malthusian-based approaches, and Gita Sen also helped us with that, is that technological innovation, right? The Earth is not an unchanging, infinite set of resources. People with technology can make more resources with less. And certainly, we want to be thinking about the role that technology plays in challenging these natural limits. And really importantly, population control, rather than a reconfiguration of the global distribution of goods and services, is the solution to famine and ecological crisis. Yes, I most certainly believe that women in India should have access to birth control should they want it. Right? But that is because it's what makes sense for them and their lives, and a decision that they've made themselves with full autonomy, not to solve the environmental degradation problems caused elsewhere. Okay? I want to be really clear on that. So the problem with Malthus and Ehrlich and his ideas in particular is that women's reproductive issues are seen as a way to control population rather than to promote human rights. And and this goes back to all of the ways that we've thought about the politics of science in this class, that these Malthusian arguments, whether it's Malthus in 1798 or Paul Ehrlich in 1968, it hides behind scientific objectivity. You know, Paul Ehrlich is saying, oh, well, I'm an ecologist and et cetera, and you people just don't understand my science. I'm still right, yeah. Is that whether you're Carl Linnaeus or you're Paul Ehrlich, you're using science to universalize your particular worldview and claim its truth. And people believe it. You put a label on something as science, and people stop thinking critically about what the arguments are and their origins. Okay. So here's just the last slide, folks, here. And then I'll send you on your way. Malthus's principle of population, you know, he argued that overpopulation was inevitable, that the poor were unable to control their fertility, and that food and other forms of social relief would just perpetuate the problem. So he argues that this overpopulation and its inevitability leads to famine, starvation, and misery. But really what he was doing was justifying the enclosures, the privatization of land, and he was arguing against his wealthy class being taxed to provide relief for these people. His ideas have been taken up in eugenics, and certainly the Green Revolution, and really importantly, environmental fears, right? Since the 1960s, and the concerns about the environment and climate change have become more important, Malthus's blame game has been repurposed to explain environmental problems, okay? And what this does as a discourse is that it deters our attention away from the role of consumption in all of this. Right? So I think that's all. That was a lot. Thanks for hanging with me today. Go have some small scale organic farming and or some beer, should you be interested in either, apparently. And does anybody have any questions?
Oh, how do you want the essays to be turned in on Sunday?
Oh, good question. Hi, Zach. You're going to post those to assignments.
Okay.
And I will send an email out to the class, making that extra clear. Thanks for the reminder.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Are your office hours tomorrow from 2 to 3?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So that's a great place for you to raise any last minute questions you have about the paper. And folks, you know, if I know that probably those of you who are participating today are probably not in this situation, but as per usual, if you have something going on and you need a few extra days, send me an email. I'm really wanting to accommodate everybody's situation, and I want you to write the best paper possible. So we have a little bit of wiggle room with that deadline if you need it, okay?
All right. Thank you. I'll see you on Monday.
Next time. All right. Be well, everyone. I'm hoping that you're all doing great, and I hope to see you again at the next lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you.